Did you even graduate, or did you just wander in here by mistake? Daniel Whitmore's voice cut clean through the glass-walled boardroom, sharp enough to stop every whispered side conversation mid-breath, and for a second the entire room seemed to hold still, like the air itself had been pulled tight across polished steel and marble, waiting to see what would happen next, while a few quiet chuckles slipped out from the far end of the table, nervous at first, then a little bolder, as if permission had just been granted. And all eyes turned, not to Daniel, not to the projection glowing across the 40-inch screen, but to the man standing near the wall, Marcus Reed, who hadn't taken a seat, who hadn't introduced himself, who hadn't said a single word since he walked in exactly 12 minutes earlier, his navy suit clean but modest, cuffs slightly worn, shoes polished but not new, the kind of details people like Daniel noticed in seconds and judged in less, yet Marcus didn't react. Didn't flinch, didn't even shift his weight, his gaze steady on the presentation's slide as if the insult had passed through him without landing, though the faint reflection of the overhead lights caught in his eyes revealed something else entirely. Focus, quiet and unshaken, the kind built over years no one in that room had witnessed. Daniel leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping once against the table, a smirk settling comfortably across his face. The confidence of someone who had never been challenged in a room like this, someone who believed authority came from volume and presence, not substance, and beside him a senior analyst leaned in slightly, whispering something under his breath that earned a low laugh in return, while at the far end a woman adjusted her tablet, pretending not to notice, pretending this was normal, because in rooms like this, it often was, and Marcus finally moved, not quickly, not defensively, just a small step forward. Enough for the light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows to fall across his face, illuminating the calm set of his expression, the measured breath he took, the subtle adjustment of his cuff as if preparing for something no one else could yet see, and the screen behind Daniel flickered to the next slide, numbers cascading down in neat columns, projections stretching out over the next fiscal year, and for a moment the room shifted its attention back to the data, back to the comfort of charts and forecasts, but Marcus's eyes remained fixed, tracing each figure with precision, as if he had seen it all before, as if something beneath the surface didn't quite align, and the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore, it was charged, thin and brittle, like glass under pressure, waiting for the slightest touch to crack it wide open. Marcus had learned a long time ago that silence could be louder than defense, that in rooms filled with polished shoes and tailored confidence, the ones who spoke the least were often the ones who saw the most, and as the low hum of the projector continued and the faint scent of roasted coffee lingered in the air, he let the moment stretch, not out of hesitation but out of control, because control was never about reacting. It was about choosing when not to, his fingers resting lightly at his side, relaxed, steady, while the numbers on the screen shifted again, quarterly forecasts expanding into annual projections, each figure presented with the kind of certainty that made people comfortable, the kind of certainty that rarely survived scrutiny, and Marcus's eyes followed the sequence without effort, catching the small inconsistencies that most would miss, a decimal that had been rounded too generously, a growth rate that leaned more on optimism than evidence, details buried just deep enough to pass unnoticed in a room that preferred agreement over accuracy. And near the center of the table Daniel continued speaking, his tone smooth now, confident again, as if the earlier remark had already been absorbed into the rhythm of the meeting, as if it had not revealed anything at all about him, his hand gesturing toward the screen while he outlined the projected expansion, each word carefully placed, each sentence rehearsed in the mirror of his own certainty, and a few heads nodded along, some out of belief, others out of habit, because in spaces like this agreement often moved faster than thought, and Marcus shifted his gaze briefly, not toward Daniel but toward the others, reading the room the way he always did, noticing the slight hesitation in one executive's posture, the way another avoided eye contact, the subtle signs of doubt that never reached the surface. And for a moment his attention returned inward, to the quiet weight of the path that had brought him there, years spent in rooms far less forgiving, where mistakes cost more than reputation, where rebuilding meant starting from numbers that were already broken, where no one had offered him a seat, only a problem, and he had learned to listen before speaking, to measure before correcting, to understand before revealing, because timing was everything, and here, now, the timing had not yet arrived. And the sunlight shifted slightly across the table, reflecting off the glass surface in a thin line that stretched toward him, catching the edge of his sleeve, and he adjusted it again, almost absent-mindedly, a small movement that contrasted sharply with the growing tension beneath the calm surface of the room, and somewhere behind him a chair creaked softly as someone leaned back, the sound barely noticeable but enough to mark the passing seconds, and Marcus exhaled slowly, steady and controlled, his mind already several steps ahead of the conversation unfolding in front of him, seeing not just what was being said, but what would happen if no one challenged it, and still, he waited, because patience was not weakness, it was preparation, and when he finally chose to speak, it would not be to defend himself, it would be to change the direction of the entire room. Daniel Whitmore had built his reputation on control, not precision, and in his mind the two had always been the same, his career shaped by rooms like this one where confidence filled the gaps that detail left behind, where speaking first often meant speaking last, and as he continued outlining the company's expansion strategy his voice carried that familiar authority, smooth and measured, each word landing exactly where he intended, reinforced by years of being listened to without interruption. His posture relaxed against the high-backed leather chair, one arm resting casually along the edge of the table as if the space itself belonged to him, and in many ways it did, at least until now, because Daniel was not just presenting numbers, he was reinforcing a hierarchy, one where people like him led and people like Marcus observed, one where appearances aligned with expectation and expectation rarely faced challenge. And around him the room responded accordingly, subtle nods, quiet affirmations, the occasional note typed into a tablet, all small signals of agreement that built a rhythm he understood well, a rhythm that made it easy to overlook the quiet variables, the unseen risks, the voices that did not push their way forward, and Daniel preferred it that way, because complexity slowed momentum and doubt weakened authority, and authority was the one thing he never questioned, especially not in front of others, and yet beneath that polished surface there was a pattern he did not recognize. A pattern forming in the stillness of the man standing near the wall, because Marcus was not disengaged, he was observing with intention, measuring not just the numbers but the man presenting them, noting the confidence that masked assumption, the ease that replaced verification, the subtle dismissal that had come so naturally just minutes earlier, and for Daniel those moments had already passed, filed away as insignificant, but for Marcus they were data, as important as any projection on the screen, revealing not just what Daniel knew, but what he chose not to see, and across the table a senior partner leaned forward, slightly, asking a question about projected margins in the third quarter, a question that Daniel answered without hesitation, his tone unwavering, his explanation clean and immediate, and a few approving glances followed, reinforcing the narrative he had constructed, yet the answer itself lingered in the air just long enough for Marcus to recognize the gap within it, not a mistake obvious enough to disrupt the flow, but a weakness that would grow over time if left unaddressed, the kind of oversight that did not announce itself until it was too late, and still Marcus said nothing, because the moment had not yet arrived, and Daniel continued, stepping into the next segment of the presentation with renewed confidence, unaware that the foundation beneath his authority was already beginning to shift, not through confrontation, not through volume, but through the quiet presence of someone who understood that real power did not need to prove itself immediately, it only needed to wait for the right moment to be undeniable. The shift happened so quietly that at first no one realized it had begun, just a slight pause between slides, a fraction longer than usual, the kind of silence that most people instinctively rush to fill. But Marcus did not rush, he stepped forward instead, one measured step that brought him closer to the table, closer to the light, and closer to the center of a conversation he had not yet been invited into, and when he spoke his voice was calm, steady, not loud but precise enough to cut through the room without force. The third quarter projection assumes a carryover growth rate of 12% from a segment that declined by 4% over the last two reporting cycles. And just like that the rhythm broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. A few heads turned back toward the screen, others glanced at Daniel, waiting for the correction, the dismissal, the controlled to reassert itself, and Daniel let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "We have already accounted for seasonal adjustments," he replied, his tone still smooth but tighter now, a thin edge forming beneath the surface, and Marcus nodded slightly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, his eyes never leaving the data. "Seasonal adjustments do not reverse a negative trend without a structural change in the underlying model," he said just as evenly, and this time the room did not laugh. The silence that followed was different, heavier, as if something invisible had just shifted out of alignment, and Daniel straightened in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still, his gaze locking on to Marcus with a focus that had not been there before. "And what exactly would you know about our underlying model?" he asked, the question framed as dismissal but delivered with a hint of caution he could not fully hide, and Marcus did not hesitate. "Enough to know that the margin expansion you are projecting relies on cost efficiencies that are not reflected in your current operational structure." And somewhere to the left a pen stopped moving, mid-note, while across the table a woman leaned forward slightly, her attention no longer on Daniel, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the confidence still there but now accompanied by something else, something less comfortable, because this was no longer a passing interruption, this was a challenge that did not match the image he had already assigned, and he leaned forward, placing both hands on the table as if anchoring himself back into control. "You are out of line," he said, quieter now, more controlled. "This is not your meeting." And for a brief second it seemed like the room might return to its previous state, that the hierarchy would reassert itself and the moment would dissolve. But Marcus remained where he was, steady, composed, the light still resting across his face, and when he spoke again it was not to argue, not to defend, but to clarify. "No," he said, just one word, simple and grounded. "But it is my responsibility." And the words did not land like defiance, they landed like fact, and that was what unsettled the room the most, not the correction, not the numbers, but the certainty, because certainty without permission had a way of revealing truths that authority alone could not contain, and for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel did not respond immediately, and in that pause, that small but undeniable gap, the balance of the room began to tilt. The tension did not break all at once, it tightened, slowly and deliberately, like a wire being pulled just past the point of comfort, and Daniel Whitmore felt it before anyone else did, not in the room, but in himself, in the way his breath shortened slightly, in the way his fingers pressed harder against the polished glass table, in the way the familiar rhythm he relied on had slipped just enough to make him aware of it. And awareness was something he rarely welcomed in moments like this, because awareness meant something was no longer fully under his control, and he did not like that, not here, not in front of people who had always seen him as certain, as composed, as right, and so he leaned forward again, reclaiming space with posture, with presence, with the authority he had built over years. "You are making assumptions without full visibility," he said, his voice sharper now, more deliberate, each word placed like a boundary. "And that is exactly how bad decisions are made." And a few heads nodded, not strongly, not confidently, but enough to suggest alignment, enough to give Daniel something to stand on, and Marcus listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just absorbing the words as they settled into the air between them, and when Daniel continued, his tone carried a trace of impatience that had not been there before. "If you have concerns, you can address them through the proper channels, not by interrupting a presentation you were not invited to speak in." And there it was again, the line drawn, not just about process, but about place, about who belonged and who did not, and for a brief moment it seemed like the room might accept that framing, that the disruption would be categorized, contained, dismissed, and then forgotten, because that was easier than questioning the foundation of what had just been revealed, and one of the executives near the middle of the table cleared his throat lightly, as if preparing to redirect the conversation, to smooth over the edges, to return everything to its expected course, and even the faint hum of the projector seemed louder in that moment, filling the silence with something neutral, something safe. But Marcus did not step back, he did not retreat to the wall where he had stood before, instead he remained exactly where he was, grounded, composed, his presence no longer peripheral but central, and when he spoke again his voice carried the same calm as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something firmer. Not forceful, not aggressive, but undeniable. The proper channel is the one that prevents a preventable loss, he said, and the words landed differently this time, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as a principle, and principles were harder to dismiss than opinions, and the room felt it, the subtle shift from disagreement to consideration, from reaction to reflection, and Daniel's expression tightened just enough to reveal that he felt it too, though he would not acknowledge it, not yet. Because to acknowledge it would mean stepping out of the role he had built, and he was not ready to do that, so instead he reached for something familiar, something reliable. Security, he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the word carried, and from near the door a man in a dark suit straightened slightly, not moving yet, but ready, waiting for confirmation, waiting for direction, and the room watched, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, others with quiet anticipation, because this was no longer just about numbers, this was about authority, about who had it, and who was allowed to exercise it, and Marcus turned his head just slightly toward the door, acknowledging the presence without reacting to it, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, and then he looked back at Daniel, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, clarity, the kind that did not need volume to be heard, the kind that did not need permission to exist, and in that moment the silence returned, deeper than before, heavier, filled not with uncertainty but with the weight of a decision that had not yet been made, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they could not yet name it. No one moved when Daniel said the word, not immediately, not fully, because something in the room resisted it, something subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in pressure before a storm, and the man near the door who had straightened at the command remained where he was, his hand hovering just slightly at his side, waiting for a second signal that did not come, while the faint hum of the projector continued to fill the silence. Steady and mechanical, in contrast to the stillness that had settled over every person at the table, and Marcus stood in that stillness without tension, without urgency, as if time itself had slowed around him, his shoulders relaxed, his breath even, the light from the windows now softer as a cloud passed overhead, muting the sharp reflections on the glass and leaving the room in a quieter shade, and in that softer light the details became clearer, the slight crease in Daniel's brow, the way one executive's pen remained suspended above her notebook, the subtle glance exchanged between two partners who had begun to reconsider what they were witnessing, and Marcus let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, not as a performance, but as a space where truth could settle without interruption, because he understood something Daniel did not, that power enforced too quickly often revealed its own weakness, and so he waited, not for permission, not for approval, but for the moment to reveal itself fully, and as seconds passed the tension did not escalate. It transformed, shifting from confrontation into something quieter, something heavier, something that asked a different question entirely, and Marcus lowered his gaze briefly to the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the glass surface, feeling the coolness beneath his skin, grounding himself not in the room but in the clarity he carried with him, and for a moment his reflection appeared faintly in the polished surface. Not distorted, not diminished, just present, and he lifted his eyes again, meeting Daniel's gaze without challenge, without retreat, simply holding it, steady and unshaken, and when he spoke his voice was softer than before, not because it needed to be louder, but because it did not. "You are not wrong to protect the company," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "But you are wrong about what protects it." And the words did not land like criticism, they landed like recognition, as if acknowledging a truth Daniel had not yet allowed himself to see, and somewhere in the room a chair shifted slightly, the sound small but significant in the quiet, and Daniel did not respond. Right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because the response he had prepared no longer fit the moment unfolding in front of him, and for the first time since the meeting began the room was not looking to him for direction, it was waiting, collectively, for something else, something more grounded, more certain, and Marcus did not move to fill that space, he did not press further, he simply stood there, present, composed, allowing the silence to complete what words alone could not, and in that silence the balance of the room settled into a new alignment, one that no one had announced, but everyone could feel. The silence did not break with a sound, it broke with a realization, subtle at first, almost invisible, like the shift of light across the glass table as the clouds outside moved just enough to let the sun return, and in that returning light the room seemed sharper, clearer, as if something that had been hidden was now impossible to ignore, and it was not Marcus who moved, not yet, it was the chairman at the far end of the table. A man who had remained quiet through the entire exchange, observing with the patience of someone who understood that timing often mattered more than intervention, and he leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing as his gaze moved from Daniel to Marcus and then back again, not hurried, not uncertain, just deliberate. "That is enough," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that immediately shifted the attention of the room, and even Daniel straightened, instinctively responding to the authority in that tone, though his expression remained tight, controlled, and the chairman turned his head slightly toward the screen before speaking again. "The concern raised is valid," he continued, each word measured, leaving no room for dismissal, and a faint ripple moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to confirm what some had already begun to suspect, and Daniel's jaw tightened further, the certainty he had held now facing something it could not easily override. "We can review the model after the meeting," he replied, attempting to regain structure, to contain the moment within process, but the chairman did not nod, did not agree. Instead he shifted his attention fully to Marcus, studying him with a look that carried recognition, not surprise, and that recognition changed something, quietly but completely, because it meant this moment was not unfolding by accident. "No," the chairman said, gently but firmly. "We will address it now." And the words settled into the room with finality, and then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should, he added, "And I believe it is time we clarify something before we continue." And the room stilled again, deeper than before, the kind of stillness that comes not from tension but from anticipation, and Daniel's eyes flickered, just once, toward Marcus, as if searching for something he had missed, something that no longer aligned with the assumptions he had made, and the chairman's gaze followed that same line, resting on Marcus with quiet certainty. "You have all reviewed the announcements sent this morning," he said, his voice even, almost casual, but the effect was immediate. A few heads turned, a tablet screen lit up as someone scrolled quickly, and Daniel's brow furrowed slightly, confusion threading through his composure. "The board has completed its transition," the chairman continued, "effective immediately." And the words seemed simple, but the weight behind them began to unfold in real time, piece by piece, and Marcus did not move, did not step forward, did not claim the space. He simply stood where he was as the realization traveled across the room, from one face to another, until it reached Daniel, and when it did, the shift was unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because in that moment the hierarchy he had relied on, the assumptions he had made, the authority he had exercised without question, all of it realigned around a truth he had not seen coming, and for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Whitmore did not have the room. The realization did not arrive with noise, it arrived with weight, settling into the room like something undeniable, something that could not be undone once seen, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because anything they might say felt smaller than the truth that had just been revealed, and Daniel Whitmore felt it most, not in the room, but in himself, in the sudden shift of his posture, in the way his shoulders no longer rested as easily against the chair, in the way his eyes moved, searching for something to hold on to, some detail that could restore the structure he had relied on, but there was none, because the structure had already changed, and across from him Marcus Reed remained exactly as he had been, composed, grounded, not stepping forward to claim authority, not raising his voice to assert it, simply allowing it to exist, and that was what made it impossible to ignore, because authority that did not need to announce itself often carried the most weight. And Daniel's lips parted slightly as if to speak, to explain, to correct, but the words did not come immediately, they hesitated, caught somewhere between intention and realization, and when he finally did speak his voice was quieter than before, stripped of the confidence that had filled it earlier. "I was not aware," he said, the sentence incomplete, the meaning clear, and Marcus looked at him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a steady clarity that left no space for performance, and he nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not of the apology, but of the moment itself. "That is the point," Marcus replied, his tone even, not sharp, not dismissive, just honest, and the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that did not accuse but revealed, and Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, the reflection of the table catching the movement, and for the first time the room did not look to him for direction, it watched him instead, not with hostility, not with judgment, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted beyond recovery, and one of the executives adjusted her seat, the soft sound marking the passing of the moment, while another closed his tablets slowly, as if acknowledging that the conversation had moved beyond numbers, beyond projections, into something more fundamental, and Marcus finally stepped forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one measured movement. That brought him to the head of the table, the space that had always been there, waiting, and he rested his hand lightly against the back of the chair without sitting, his gaze moving across the room, meeting each person not as a challenge but as a presence, and when he spoke again his voice carried the same calm as before, but now it filled the space differently, not as interruption, not as correction, but as direction. "We will review the model," he said, simple, clear, "and we will fix what needs to be fixed." And there was no hesitation in the room this time, no resistance, just a quiet alignment that followed the words naturally. Because they were no longer being weighed against authority, they were being recognized as it, and Daniel remained still, absorbing the shift, understanding it in a way that did not require explanation, because some lessons did not come from instruction, they came from contrast. And in that contrast he saw it clearly, the difference between control and leadership, between assumption and awareness, and Marcus did not ask for acknowledgement, did not demand apology. He simply turned his attention back to the screen, to the work, to the reason they were all there, and in that choice, that quiet return to purpose, the room found its direction again. Marcus lowered himself into the chair with a quiet, controlled motion, not rushed, not ceremonious, just deliberate, the soft glide of leather against fabric barely audible beneath the hum of the room, and when he settled, the space seemed to settle with him, as if the chair had not been filled until that exact moment, and no one spoke, not because they were told to remain silent, but because something deeper had taken hold. Something that did not require instruction, and the light from the windows stretched across the table once more, reflecting off glass and polished wood, tracing a line that now led directly to where Marcus sat, steady and composed, his hands resting lightly in front of him, fingers relaxed, no tension, no urgency, just presence, and across from him Daniel Whitmore remained still, his posture no longer leaning back in ease, no longer anchored in certainty, but upright, attentive. The shift subtle yet unmistakable, his gaze lowered for a brief moment before lifting again, not in challenge, not in defense, but in recognition, and it was in that recognition that the final piece of the moment settled into place, because what had changed was not just the structure of the room, it was the understanding within it, the quiet acknowledgement of something that should have been obvious from the beginning, and Marcus did not address it, did not call it out, did not turn the moment into a lesson spoken aloud. Instead he reached forward and adjusted the presentation remote slightly, the small click of plastic against glass echoing. Just enough to mark the continuation of the meeting, not as it had been, but as it now was, and when he spoke his voice carried no trace of what had happened before, no edge, no weight beyond what was necessary. "Let us continue," he said, simple, direct, and the words moved through the room like a reset, not erasing what had happened, but placing it where it belonged, behind them, as context rather than conflict, and the screen shifted again, numbers returning, projections realigning, but this time the room engaged differently, more carefully, more deliberately, questions asked with intention rather than assumption, answers considered rather than accepted, and Daniel listened, fully now, his pen moving across his notebook in slow, measured strokes, not performing, not asserting, just taking in what he had missed before, and Marcus guided the discussion without force, without interruption. His presence enough to hold the room in alignment, and minutes passed, then more, the meeting finding its rhythm again, but a different rhythm, one grounded not in control, but in clarity, and when at last the discussion reached its natural pause, Marcus leaned back slightly, not in dominance, not in display, but in completion, his gaze moving once more across the room, meeting each person where they sat, and no one looked away, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and in that final quiet, no words were needed, because the truth had already settled into every corner of the room, not spoken, not declared, but felt, in the stillness, in the light, in the space between breaths, where respect, once missing, now remained.